Alrighty then, we are back. Back in the saddle. Much to discuss, although I don't know where to begin. So I'm going to kill about 20 more seconds before I land on my starting point. I guess I would begin by saying that the rage that Bernie provokes when he dares to refrain from kowtowing to AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, it sort of just engenders in me a visceral desire to vehemently defend Bernie, notwithstanding any criticisms or objections I have with him or his campaign around the margins, because very few entities in American public life deserve a stark and unequivocal rebuke more than AIPAC. AIPAC is a propaganda lobbyist organization which exerts pressure on the whole of the American bipartisan landscape to demand that they come and pay fealty to the sacrosanct nature of the American-Israeli relationship. Everybody is expected, if they want to gain a foothold on American political power, to go to the AIPAC conference, to develop and sustain relationships with AIPAC lobbyists, and solemnly proclaim how metaphysically committed they are to nurturing this wonderful and necessary and cosmically important allyship. And it makes me wonder, okay, so let's assess the greatest ally of the United States. Let's think about it. What are some traditional roles that a so-called ally would play? When I think of the concept of an ally country, I tend to think of that country deploying alongside American troops on the battlefield. I tend to think of them sacrificing alongside troops in war. That's certainly what we think of when we think of the United States allies during, for example, World War II. France was an ally, the UK was an ally, etc. And that's evidenced by French and UK troops dying by the hundreds of thousands alongside US troops fighting in Europe and elsewhere. Now, the US has been in a constant state of war since 2001. The US continues to sustain casualties in Afghanistan and even Iraq and Syria. How many Israeli soldiers have been killed, have paid the ultimate sacrifice alongside their great allies in the United States? How many Israeli soldiers and US soldiers are in the foxhole together, taking casualties together like you would expect allies to do? The answer to that is zero. Goose egg. No Israeli soldiers have died fighting alongside the United States in Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, I'm told that that has no bearing on whether Israel is our greatest ally, because we demand or request or cajole Israel to not deploy their forces alongside U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other Muslim majority countries, because it would be a strategic disadvantage because of the widespread hostility toward Israel in the Muslim Arab world. Well, interesting. Let's further examine that premise. If Israel is so toxic, to use the cliche, across the whole of the Muslim Arab world that they can't even ally with the U.S. to assist our military adventurism, and I'm not even supporting this military adventurism, I'm just assessing what the traditional standards would be to proclaim a country an ally. If Israel is such a toxic presence that we can't even dream of asking them to deploy their troops alongside ours, maybe that should say something about their utility in a strategic sense. Maybe giving them this unflinching religious or quasi-religious support does not actually advance U.S. interests. Maybe they don't need the $3.8 billion that we send them on an annual basis for military aid that allows them to continue perpetuating an occupation that is illegal by every conceivable metric. It's been underway for decades, since 1967. Maybe this allyship is not all it's cracked up to be. But what AIPAC does is they have a PR and propaganda operation in concert with a whole constellation of other so-called pro-Israel forces, whether they be donors, whether they be people in the media, whether they be politicians, etc. All of them sort of coalesce to demand that these questions never be asked, because automatically it's supposed to create suspicion of you, that you are anti-Semitic, that you hate Jews, even though the individual in question here, the political figure who is challenging the power of AIPAC, is himself a Jew whose family was killed in the Holocaust. So they can throw around the anti-Semitism canard all they want, and they can say, oh, Bernie's not a real Jew, he's self-hating. They can do the little nasally Ben Shapiro response where they talk really fast and they demand that to everybody acknowledge that Bernie Sanders is not a Jew because he's a ethnic Jew and he's not a religious Jew and he doesn't actually support Judaism. They can do all that stuff. But you know what? When ordinary people try to analyze the situation, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for them to assert that Bernie Sanders, in challenging AIPAC as a Jew, whether you want to say he's a quote-unquote real Jew or not, is exhibiting anti-Semitism. No, maybe he has some rational reasons for not buckling to the pressure of an organization whose influence is nefarious, such as AIPAC. I remember in 2016 when people were, really concerned, especially Republican neoconservatives and Bush supporters and people, they were saying, "Oh, Trump has made scattered comments when he appeared before the the Republican, not Russian, Freudian slip. Like when he appeared before a Republican Jewish committee event and said something like, I have a lot of you people managing my money. Don't quote me on that. I'm paraphrasing. With something like that. You can go look it up. But he made a comment that was like a pretty mild joke that you'd hear on any street corner in New York City amongst people who are not at all hostile to Jews, but actually endeared of them, and making very light fun of the stereotypes around Jews. Jews themselves make these jokes all the time. Have you ever listened to the Howard Stern show? So Trump was making a joke along those lines, and it caused consternation. They're saying, oh, is Trump a secret anti-Semite? Is Trump going to forsake the American-Israeli relationship? And these fears were bolstered by more random, semi-incoherent statements that Trump made about wanting to be neutral between Israel and Palestine in the course of the negotiations. One could strike between Israel and Palestine, and he was going to do it. He was going to apply his apprentice skills to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which turned out to manifest by him sending Jared Kushner to draw up a peace plan between Israel and Palestine that had zero input at all from Palestinians. So that was the fruits of that pledge. But anyway, back in 2016, these scattered comments from Trump were taken as indication that he was not going to be a reliable defender of Israel. And then, sure enough, a month or two later, what does Trump do? Goes before the AIPAC conference, gives a rousing pro-Israel speech, and all the concerns were assuaged. Nobody had any doubt at that point that Trump was going to be yet another subservient promoter of all things Israel all the time. Trump in 2015, 2016 said that he doesn't need any money from the Republican donor class. In fact, those people are corrupt because they buy off politicians, including his fellow Republicans, to gain access and to get their preferred policies enacted. So Trump was a self-funder. He didn't need them, and that's why he was so refreshingly independent. That's why he was somebody who could take on the establishment. And now what? Trump is best buddies with Sheldon Adelson, one of the most ghoulish people in the entire country and perhaps the world. He looks like a grotesque billionaire slug, like the caricature of that sort of person. And Sheldon Adelson, it's actually Sheldon Adelson, easy to mispronounce. Sheldon Adelson. And how do you remember that? Because Sheldon Adelson is adding up his money, not aiding up his money. So Sheldon Adelson now has premier VIP access to the White House, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on Trump, and the Republicans was the top donor to Republicans in 2018. Whenever there's some Israeli-related event at the White House, he's right there in the front row, hunched over, looking like an obese slug, and smiling sinisterly because his plan has come into fruition. So that's the record of Trump vis-a-vis AIPAC and the pro-Israel lobby. And now people want to go after Bernie for declining to go and pay tribute to AIPAC at this disgusting spectacle that they have every year in the form of their annual conference. Now, I have nothing against, on principle, engaging with even the most ardent pro-Israel people over the course of diplomatic negotiations, over the course of just gaining a better understanding of their position, etc. But AIPAC is not a neutral forum. It's a lobbyist confab It's basically just a PR event for the pro-Israel lobby. And the real action at the AIPAC conference goes on behind the scenes. The speeches are just the public portion. So why should Bernie go to that conference? Bernie is demonstrating that he has a different set of incentives than are normally operative for prospective presidential nominees of either party, which is that he has a vast grassroots movement that are funding his campaign, and he's relying on them for financial sustenance, not the typical crowd of donors, many of whom are ardent pro-Israel people. So he doesn't have to placate them. In fact, he's more indebted to the small dollar donor who is deeply skeptical of Israel, especially now, given the reign of Netanyahu, given how Israel is constantly attempting to interfere in U.S. politics on behalf of Republican candidates, dating back to 2012 when Benjamin Netanyahu interfered in that election on behalf of his friend from Boston, Mitt Romney. 2016, Benjamin Netanyahu was very obviously pro-Trump, even though he was also fine with Hillary. And 2020, there's zero doubt who he'll support. That will be Trump. I wouldn't be surprised to see Netanyahu cut an overt campaign ad for Trump. I believe Trump, in fact, has cut campaign ads for Netanyahu in the past. So it's very positive, in my view, that Bernie is not defiling himself by going to this ridiculous AIPAC conference. And you're going to see the worst elements of the Democratic coalition and the media recoil in horror at this. Already some representatives, members of the House, some of whom were supporting Mike Bloomberg, like Josh Gottheimer, or is it Gottenheimer? I don't even know or care. The deplorable, and I use that word intentionally, Democratic representative from New Jersey, who is this finance guy. In his Twitter bio, he says he's very proud of formerly being a corporate comms person for Microsoft. Let me look this up, actually, because I just saw it, and I want to make sure I have it right. Yeah, Gottheimer, Democratic representative from New Jersey. This guy is just despicable in every single way. 5th Congressional District of New Jersey. If you live in the district, which I'm very familiar with, I've never lived in it, but always lived around it. Not always, but often have lived around it. Primary this guy. I'll help you because he's sick. Former Microsoft corporate strat, he says in his Twitter bio. Former Bill Clinton speechwriter. Proud dad and NJ resident. Me. And he tweeted out tonight at 11:02 p.m. Senator Sanders owes an immediate apology for his appalling comments about AIPAC and those who believe deeply in it in the U.S.-Israel relationship, a strategic alliance that is key to the fight against terror. Yeah, has that strategic alliance produced better safety outcomes for the United States or worse? Do you think if the U.S. and Israel were not perceived to be joined at the hip throughout the Arab and Muslim world, would that improve the image of the U.S. or harm it? I can't imagine why there'd be widespread resentment about a country that is essentially annexing territory that belongs to another population, subjugates them, bombs them into smithereens every couple of years, codifies their second-class treatment in their governing structures, I can't imagine why that would cause resentment, given that the U.S. underwrites those activities with its military aid and its diplomatic cover. It's just a total mystery to me. Does the partnership against terror that supposedly this strategic alliance makes possible, is that enhanced by the Israeli military constantly bombing various places? I mean, they've been bombing Iraq recently for the first time since the early 80s. Does that help, quote, stabilize the Middle East? Please. Josh Gottheimer is a joke. Go Google him and read the Intercept article from Ryan Grimm from last May or June about his comically aggressive, arrogant behavior, which is why his staff all hate him. Man, this guy is close to a psychopath. And guess what? Of course, he endorsed Mike Bloomberg. After having been with the entire New Jersey delegation behind Cory Booker, but he made the seamless transition to Mike Bloomberg. And he's going to lecture people about what it means to be a real Democrat or something. I mean, you're supporting a Republican oligarch who turned New York City into a corporatized surveillance state. And the first time Mike Bloomberg actually got before the public in an adversarial context, he melted down into a pool of blubbering muck. So that's Josh Gottheimer for you. And those are the people who are most ardent now about denouncing Bernie. And then you have this whole thing about Bernie like defending Cuba. Okay, number one, I find it hilarious and ironic that Trump supporters in particular would be up in arms about Bernie making an observation about the history of Fidel Castro instituting programs in Cuba that improved literary rates, which is just true. I find it odd that the Trump supporters would be up in arms about that when Trump has bragged and boasted about how he exchanges love letters, that's his term, love letters, with Kim Jong-un, who runs a Stalinist totalitarian dictatorship. Now, if you followed my commentary on the North Korea diplomatic issue, you know that I've generally been in favor of Trump's approach, and I've defended it against cynical naysayers in the Democratic Party who try to make a big deal over these, expressions of diplomatic, kindness. But it's hilarious that conservative nationalist MAGA people who came up with a whole variety of excuses for why Trump doing it with Kim Jong-un was fine now want to turn around and use that very same logic against Bernie, even though what Trump did is far more tangible with Kim Jong-un than anything Bernie has done with Cuba. I mean, making an observation about literacy rates while also coupling that with criticisms of the authoritarian elements of the Castro reign pales in comparison to actually meeting a Kim Jong-un in person, giving him some semblance of credibility on the world stage. Again, I am in favor of that, but it's not consistent to embrace and celebrate that, but then launch into this emotional uproar over Bernie making scattered comments about Cuba. And the same goes for the Democratic representatives who were screaming about Cuba, including many from Florida, who are outraged about Bernie's comments. Okay, so were they also outraged when Barack Obama initiated a diplomatic opening with Cuba, a thawing of the relations between the U.S. and Cuba? Was Obama evil and wrong for doing that? Which occurred while Raul Castro was in power. He's out now. But Obama did that with the Castro regime or with government. So, the Democrats who are now saying that this is outside the bounds of acceptable behavior should be asked if they're retroactively condemning Barack Obama. And anyway, I don't think people generally care about this stuff. I think that people making a big deal about Bernie supposedly backing, left-wing authoritarian regimes, they're running the same playbook that could have been run against a Democratic candidate in like 1980. It's just a reheated Reagan. Scare up some elderly people in South Florida by invoking Castro and saying that Bernie, I don't know, what is he going to do? Like erect a statue to Fidel Castro in Washington? Like, what is going to be the practical consequence of his observations about Cuba? Nobody seems to explain that. So, yeah, you can probably get a couple people in the Miami, Fort Lauderdale area riled up by making a fuss about Castro. But beyond that, it's not just that this line of attack has wide purchase throughout the country. It's similar to why a lot of the Putin stuff that's used against Trump is garbage. It preoccupies the people who are extremely plugged into the daily media controversy, who follow the ins and outs of every cable news plot twist, but it's never really resonated in the lives of the broad swath of voters. It's just overrepresented amongst the hyper-partisan liberal activists who spend every waking hour of their lives dreaming about removing Trump from office and throwing him in prison. Those are the Putin obsessives. And, there's something similar about this attempt to sort of tarnish Bernie by association with Latin American dictators. First of all, I mean, there are questions to Trump supporters. They're going to accuse Bernie of loving genocidal dictators. Okay, how's this U.S.-Saudi relationship going? Where there is a genocidal war actually underway that the U.S. is actively abetting in Yemen. And you're going to say, oh, it's not just Trump who's been an ally of Saudi and propped them up. That's a long-standing bipartisan U.S. tradition. Yeah, that's the point. So Bernie diverges from the long-standing U.S. tradition in some ways. And yet you're going to go after him for breaking with that consensus in the 80s when he's the mayor of Burlington. While just accepting as normal and standard practice, Trump and other presidents funding and supporting Saudi Arabia's unhinged theocratic exportation of radicalism and destruction of their poor neighboring country. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But then again, why would it? They're just throwing everything against the wall and seeing what sticks because they have about a week to go before Super Tuesday, when Bernie could potentially get an insurmountable delegate lead. Of course, we'll have to see what happens in South Carolina. It's possible that Biden does win South Carolina still, because his best demographic by far is Southern blacks and Southern older black voters in particular. Black voters don't necessarily vote the same in South Carolina that they do in Nevada or Michigan or any place else. But Southern black voters have a particular disposition that makes them inclined to support a Biden. And that's why Biden could potentially still win in South Carolina. Although, if he doesn't win by a relatively big margin, it's a little difficult to see what the logic for him to continue to remain in the race is. And even have Mayor Pete putting out a little clip of his CNN town hall tonight. By the way, how are people still watching these CNN town halls at this point? I cannot sit through it. But he put out a little clip saying, let me pull it up. I'll just play it for you. On my phone, because of my high production values, and YouTube doesn't provide a simple option to just play clips within the actual sort of interface of the live stream.
As a Democrat, I don't want to be explaining why our nominee is encouraging people to look on the bright side of the Castro regime when we're going into the election of our lives. I don't want, as a Democrat, I don't want to be explaining why our nominee is encouraging people to look on the bright side of the Castro regime when we're going into the election of our lives. I don't want.
Okay, so that's Pete thinking that he's going to score big victories on Super Tuesday by whining on CNN about Bernie and Cuba. I mean, if that's all you have against him at this point, then you are in some trouble. And we keep hearing about this Oppo dump that's going to be coming at any moment on Bernie. And yet they're just like playing the same like two clips from public access television from Vermont from the 80s. And then, latching on to his comment on Cuba from 60 Minutes. I don't think that's really going to move public opinion all that much. Notwithstanding the desperate efforts of Mike Bloomberg, who reportedly is launching an all-out nationwide media blitz against Bernie and appointing like executives or something to be surrogates to just denounce Bernie on TV and whatever. Yeah, good luck with that. It would be one thing if Mike Bloomberg was an extremely charismatic and compelling figure who can make a persuasive argument against Bernie and couple that with whatever advantages he feels he has as somebody whose net worth is $62 billion, who founded a company, who was mayor of New York City for 3 terms. That would be one thing. Even then, his anti-Bernie attacks probably wouldn't work. But Bloomberg is a smug, arrogant, self-satisfied piece of who fell apart among even minor in reaction to even just sort of minor predictable pressure. I mean, the idea that he wouldn't have responses ready to all the accusations that were made against him on the debate stage last week is ridiculous. It's because it's like he never interacts with people who disagree with him or can challenge him or aren't just sucking up to him and trying to get money from him. So why would he be prepared to parry off attacks from competent adults? So Bloomberg, he can buy all the ads he wants. Maybe it'll work around the margins to some extent, but that's a little doubtful. All right, got some super chats here. Let us see. Jeffrey says, it's stunning how This Democratic primary has laid bare the corruption endemic to U.S. electoral politics. We can thank Tulsi and Bernie's iconoclasm for forcing the rot out into full view. Thank you for your excellent work. I largely agree with that. I will defend Tulsi's role in this race till the very end, notwithstanding her marginalization, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, she's not going to be given a town hall by CNN. Whatever contributions she can make in the position that she's in are extremely worthwhile, and she should continue doing that. Because even now, her critiques are sharpening. She's getting firsthand experience with the corrupt machinations of the political system and the way that those machinations are deployed, especially against people who challenge foreign policy consensus. Bernie can counteract it because he has a nationwide movement. So that was built up over 5 years. So it's impossible to marginalize Bernie. But Tulsi, still a little bit of a newcomer, doesn't have the network that a Bernie had. And so the marginalization can go into full force against her. And so I want her observing it firsthand and processing it and then explaining how it works. That's extremely valuable. Sparky, my benefactor, says normalizing the relations with Cuba was the best thing Obama did. Pompeo and other neocons con Trump into reversing it. Many Trumpers are disappointed. Well, if they're disappointed, I haven't heard those complaints all that much. In fact, I remember one of the first major statements that Trump put out after he was elected president in November of 2016 was when Fidel Castro died. And the statement he put out sounded like it was ghostwritten by Marco Rubio. So there's not much that's surprising about the course of action that Trump has taken vis-a-vis Cuba, especially because he just wants to pander to every possible constituency in Florida, whether that be, older Democratic-leaning Jewish voters, whether it be Cubans, whether it be Venezuelans, whoever. And you know what? Florida might be a difficult state for Bernie if he's the nominee. As would potentially Virginia. I think you probably, I'm just speculating here. I got to dig into the data a little further, but I would suspect that Northern Virginia might trend a little bit away from Bernie, were he to be the nominee, and make Virginia a little bit more difficult for him to win than the generic Democrat, although he could still potentially win it. But Florida, yeah, that's going to be rough. Although I think that's probably counterbalanced by Bernie's ability to win Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and potentially even Arizona. Although that would probably be difficult too. Costello says, "Who's going to watch the town halls for us if you want? I don't know. You got to find somebody else because I ain't doing it anymore. I can barely sit through the 1.5 minute clips that circulate on Twitter." Sparky, Buttigieg is a Five Eyes Intel community stooge. Okay, if you say so. Democracy says, "Please go on Pacman's show and debunk his propaganda. Happy to do it at any time. Put in a request for him." I've actually, I think, tweeted at him and asked to do that, and no response. So if you'd like me to go on, contact him in whatever way available, and I will happily do it. He's one of these people who I'm sure is going to pretend like he's this sagacious skeptic of Russia hysteria now that it's predictably being deployed against Bernie by these anonymous intelligence officials who are sort of filtering their insinuations through their preferred media outlets. That, I'm sure, is something that David Pacman's going to object to because there's not enough evidence. We can't just go on these anonymous reports, blah, 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 blah. And so that's going to be how a certain species of progressive, quote unquote, pundit, and you've already seen it, other people I could name but won't, are doing the same thing. They're going to make it seem like they were, oh, these too cool for school skeptics of Russia hysteria all along. But guess what? They fueled it. They gave it cross ideological legitimacy all throughout the Trump presidency, even when they were warned that it was going to be used against Bernie later on, and not just Bernie, but others, Tulsi in particular, although they tend not to like Tulsi. But they were told that this was going to backfire, and it was instilling a whole host of extremely dangerous premises in the political discourse, but they didn't care. It was circumstantially convenient for them to get on board with that nonsense when it seemed to disadvantage Trump. And now they want to turn around and pretend like they were skeptics all along. Well, you know what? They're frauds. They're disgusting. They have revealed themselves to be shameless political opportunists. And if David Pakman wants me to come on and explain that to him in copious detail and reference many of his past statements asserting a vast conspiracy by Putin to control U.S. foreign policy, then I will happily do it, but I'm not sure that he's interested. Estev asks who will drop out next. If Biden doesn't win South Carolina, I'm assuming he would have to drop out, or at least his candidacy is null and obsolete at that point. I don't see a whole lot of logic. I mean, these candidates are so dug in that they're not going to drop out unless it's just absolutely necessary. Then there's zero chance of any recovery. So I don't know. Let's see with South Carolina. That's a make or break for Biden, to use a cliche, but it is true in his case. Jeffrey says, I totally agree with you on Tulsi. I strongly support Gabbard and put my money where my mouth is. Glad she's pushing onto the convention. She does need money. Obviously, she's not running a behemoth campaign at this point. They're conserving resources. So if you are interested in her continued presence in the race, if you think it has value, especially as she's taking some of the heat for Bernie, she in various ways, by saying things that he really can't because he has to placate elements of the Democratic establishment and the DNC. She doesn't. She can let loose. She can call out the corruption in direct, stark terms. If you think that's a worthwhile presence to have in the race as an active candidate, somebody who speaks from the inside rather than just an outside observer, then, maybe give her some money. All right, people. I'm sure there's more to say. There's always more to say, but it's now 1 a.m. And I'm going to sign off now. Amazingly, there's another debate tomorrow. It seems like only yesterday that we would watch Bloomberg get bombarded. I'm getting a little sick of these debates, frankly. I would rather do, I don't know what, walk in the park, go bird watching, something, than watching it get another debate. But of course, I'll watch it regardless. Zippity Day says David Pakman, Michael Brooks, and Sam Cedar want a full-time position on MSNBC. Besides Russiagate, they promoted "We must protect the Kurds by keeping Trump in Syria" nonsense. I don't know what they want. I know Sam Cedar is an MSNBC contributor or something, so yeah, good for him. I've always said I'll engage with these people. I'll engage with virtually anybody. Most of the time, they don't want to do it. I don't know that they're scared necessarily, but maybe they are a little scared. So if you want me to go on their shows or have them come on my shows or whatever, make your opinion known to them and we'll see what happens. All right. Good night. Sleep tight.